David escaped to Philistia with his army and lived in Gath under the protection of King Achish. David had two wives with him. One had brought him an alliance with Jezreel, the other, the great wealth of Nabal of Carmel. Jonathan grieved as the reports he heard. Had David forgotten the law? The law had said a king was not to have multiple wives. Women would divide his heart. Had the years of fleeing Saul made David value military alliances over obeying the Lord their God? So much for your friend's loyalty. He beds down with our enemies, Saul said, and may return with information we sorely need. Saul shook his head, refusing to believe any good of David. If he learns the secret of forging iron, he will use it to make weapons against us. Abner looked at Jonathan grimly. Achish has given David Ziklag. Saul raged. He's out of my reach, living in Philistine territory. Anger welled in Jonathan. It will please you both to remember that Goliath was from Gath. David will be no more welcomed in Gath than he is in Judah. I had forgotten, Saul laughed. Goliath's relatives will serve me well if they kill him. Jonathan knew better. Not even Goliath's relatives would last against David and his mighty men. The Lord protected them. Over the ensuing months, Jonathan heard rumors. David went out on raids and returned with sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels, but none of the villages that had been raided in Israel had seen David. Jonathan remembered how he and David had plotted raids upon the Geshurites, the Grizerites, the Amalekites, enemies of Israel from ancient times. The Amalekites had been the worst of all, murdering the weak and weary stragglers who would not keep up with the slaves fleeing Egypt. Jonathan suspected where David gained his wealth, but the raids added to the danger David was in. Being familiar with the Hebrew songs honoring David for killing his tens of thousands, the Philistine commanders would have no reason to trust David. And knowing that David ran from Saul, they'd wonder what better way to prove himself and win back Saul's favor than by betraying his hosts, the Philistines. Jonathan laughed at David's boldness, as David grew rich from raiding Philistine villages while living under the protection of the king. Surely the Lord laughed as well. David would have time now to learn the secrets of forging iron. Not a doubt regarding his friend entered Jonathan's mind. One day David would return to Israel, and he would bring with him the resources and knowledge gained from the Philistines. The only question was whether the Lord would allow David to return in time to save Saul from his own miscalculations. Heading for Aphek, the Philistines gathered their forces, and Jonathan feared they brought God's judgment with them. Jonathan lifted Meribal onto his shoulders and went out to the field. Run, Abba, run! Meribal spread his arms like an eagle and squealed with laughter as Jonathan ran. Reaching the stone pile, Jonathan lifted his son down and set him upon his feet. I must go away again, my son. Me go too. No. Don't go. Meribal wrapped his arms around Jonathan's neck and clung. Jonathan held him tight and then pried his son's arms loose and held them at his side. Stand still. You must listen now, Meribal. This is important. Look at me. The boy raised his tear-streaked face. Remember what I have taught you. Always worship the Lord our God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Jonathan touched his son's chest and his forehead and ran his hands down his son's arms. He struggled against the emotions filling him. Was his son too young yet to understand? Lord, make him understand. Open his heart to my words. Digging his fingers into the earth, Jonathan took Meribal's hand. He poured soil into it. This is land the Lord our God gave to us. It is our inheritance. We are God's people. Your Abba must go away and fight and make sure no one takes it from us. Do you understand? I don't want you to go. Meribal had his mother's eyes, doe eyes filled with innocence and sorrow. Oh, God, protect my son. The boy's weeping pierced Jonathan's heart. Jonathan knew there was always a chance he might not return. He had never talked of David with his son before, but perhaps he was old enough now. He had to be old enough. He held Mirabal away. Do you know who David is? Enemy. No, no, Mirabal. You must listen to me. David is my friend. He's your friend too. Jonathan cupped his son's face. Remember this, Mirabal. One day you will meet David, and when you do, I want you to bow down to him. Bow down with your face to the ground the way men do before grandfather. God has chosen David to be the next king over Israel. David will be your king. Do whatever David asks of you. Be his friend as your Abba has been his friend. Don't make him sad. Merib-Baal nodded. Lifting his son, Jonathan swung him back onto his shoulders and headed back to Gibeah. The child's nurse waited at the city gate and followed them to the house. Jonathan put his son down, hugged, and kissed him. He buried his face in the side of his son's neck, inhaling his scent. Merib-Baal's arms tightened around his neck. I love you, Abba. Jonathan's heart lurched. I love you too, my son. He combed his fingers through the thick curly locks of soft hair. Practice with your bow. Listen to the reading of God's law every day. Jonathan had made arrangements for it to be read in his absence. Go now and play while I speak with your nurse. He straightened, watching his son scamper off. If you should hear that the Philistines have defeated us, hide my son quickly. Do you understand? The Philistines would sweep across the land, hunting down all of Saul's relatives and putting them to the sword if they could. Yes, my lord. He saw the nurse understood. Do as I've instructed. Do not wait for the counsel of others. Get Merib-Baal away from Gibeah. Keep him safe until David becomes king. Then take my son to him. But my lord, you need not fear David. Jonathan prepared to leave. He and I made a covenant of friendship. David will keep his oath. Jonathan saw terror in his father's eyes when the king heard that a great multitude of Philistine warriors was headed for Shuam, and David was cited among their numbers, marching at the rear with King Achish. Saul turned to Jonathan. Your friend fights for our enemies now. Never, Jonathan remained convinced. When the battle begins, King Asa will be the first to fall, and David will attack the Philistines from the rear. Abner looked grim. If that happens, we may have a chance. Without David's help, there was no hope. The Philistines vastly outnumbered the Israelites. Deserters had bled Saul's army and swollen the ranks of David's. Even the tribe of Manasseh and some from Benjamin had joined David. He led a great army now, like the army of God. We will camp at Gilboa. When Jonathan stood on the hill above the Philistine camp at Shuam, he drew his breath. His heart sank. There were so many warriors, as many as the grains of sand on the seashore. Beside him, Saul stared, appalled. We are undone. He backed away. I must pray. I must inquire of the Lord. When Jonathan turned to follow Saul, Saul shook his head. Go and see to our men, Jonathan. Encourage them. Abner will assist you. It was nightfall before Jonathan returned from his mission, and his father was nowhere to be found. Jonathan went to the king's priests. Where is Saul? He left with 2 of his attendants. It was close to dawn when the king returned to his tent, disguised as a commoner. Jonathan thought he was an intruder and drew his sword, but the king threw off his disguise and sank to his bed, his attendants melting away into the darkness. What does all this mean? Jonathan grew alarmed. Where have you been? Saul buried his head in his hands. Indoor. Indoor? Why would you go there? To learn what will happen in the battle. Jonathan felt a wave of fear sweep over him. What have you done? Saul lifted his head, wild-eyed, inquired of a sorceress. I had to speak to Samuel. I had to raise him from the dead, and only she had the power to do it. You know it is forbidden. Jonathan covered his head in shame. As God required, you expelled the mediums and spiritualists from Israel. She conjured the prophet from the grave, Saul cried out. And did you get your answers? You had killed us all. Jonathan wanted to grab his father and shake him. Even now you rebel against the Lord. You bring God's wrath upon us. I had to know what would happen tomorrow. Samuel was angry. I wanted to know why I bothered. He wanted to know why I bothered him now that the Lord has turned against me and become my enemy. All I wanted was some hope, Jonathan. Is there anything wrong with that? everything in the way he sought it. And did Samuel offer you any? Jonathan knew better. He said, the Lord has done what he predicted and torn the kingdom from me, giving it to one of my rivals, to David. Saul rocked back and forth, his face ashen. All because I didn't obey the Lord and carry out God's anger against the Amalekites. The Lord will hand us over to the Philistines. I will die tomorrow. I will die, and so will, he groaned, pressing the heels of his hands into his eyes, my sons. After the first sharp, hot stab of fear, calmness came over Jonathan. So be it, Lord. Your will be done. His father had waged war against God, and his entire family would bear the consequences. Jonathan felt a stillness inside himself. Perhaps he had known all along, in the deepest recesses of his heart, that he too had to die before David could become king. For if he survived his father, there would always be those in Benjamin, like Abner, who would want him to fight to keep the crown. Even if he swore allegiance to David, the struggle would go on and on. Saul wailed, what have I done? What have I done? He fell to the ground and wept bitterly. My sons will die, and the blame must be laid upon my head. If only I could live my life over, I would. Get up, father. The time for self-recrimination was over. Dawn approached. The enemy would not wait. I will help you put on your armor. We will go out and face the Philistines together, and may God yet show mercy upon us. God promised to show mercy to a thousand generations of those who love the Lord. God, dare I hope you will bless my son? Please protect him. Keep him out of the clutches of evil men. You will go with me? Saul's eyes were wide with fear. Even after what I've done? I will not abandon you. Have I not always honored you as a son should honor his father? And have I brought you to this? Tears glistened in Saul's eyes. Jonathan gave him a hand up. I will be where I belong, fighting at your side. He lifted his father's armor and helped him strap on the breastplate. When the king was ready, they went out together. Abner and the other commanders waited, faces grim. Jonathan saw his brothers among them, fine men of valor. His throat tightened at the knowledge that they would die today. All of them except the youngest, who was safe in Gibeah. But safe for how long? The king's armor-bearer came forward and bowed low. I was not summoned. My son Jonathan assisted me. Take your place beside me. The young man took up 2 shields and stood ready. The battle lines were drawn. A great horde of Philistines filled the horizon, and their battle cry rose. Jonathan turned, clinging to one last hope. Abner, what word of David? He is no longer with the Philistines. Jonathan met his father's gaze and saw a waking world in Saul's eyes. Was he remembering the horde of Philistines they faced so many years ago, and the boy who had rallied Israel's courage with a sling and a stone? How different today would be with David on their side. Saul gave a single nod. Jonathan drew his sword and started his run into the valley of death. The shofars were blown. Men shouted war cries. The earth shook as thousands poured down the hillsides. The enemy came on like avengers lusting for blood. Jonathan fired arrows until he had none left. The sound of battle became deafening, screams of pain, the crash of swords, iron shattering, bronze, and then wheels rolling, horses galloping, the hiss of 1,000 arrows. Malchishua was the first of Saul's sons to fall, 4 arrows in his chest. Then Abinadab gave a cry of pain, struck in the thigh. An arrow through his right eye sent him backward into the dust. Dying men shrieked in terror and were silenced by a sword. Jonathan shouted orders to retreat. The Israelites fled before the Philistines, many falling with arrows in their backs. Philistines surged up Mount Gilboa. Kill the king! Kill Saul! Saul shouted, guard me! Keep them back! Jonathan swung to the right, and to the left. He parried and thrust, blocked, and made an upward cut. But there were too many, too many. His father ran up the hill. Jonathan followed. Arrows rained down around him. Suddenly, Jonathan felt a hard blow in his side, then another in his left shoulder. Jonathan! Saul shouted. Jonathan tried to raise his sword, but his strength was gone. At first he felt no pain, and then the pain so terrible he could not move. 2 more arrows struck him in the chest. His knees buckled. My son! Saul screamed. My son! A sound of rage and despair. Swaying, Jonathan dug the point of his sword into the earth, but he could not hold himself up. When another arrow hit him, he fell heavily, driving the arrows in deeper. He rasped for breath and tasted blood. He felt the earth and grass against his cheek. He couldn't lift his head. Darkness closed in around him. Body tensing, Jonathan fought against death, his fingers digging into the soil. David, David! Lord, be with my friend when he receives the crown. Give him wisdom to rule your people Israel. Battle sounds muted, everything within him fixed upon a single spot of light in the darkness. Surrendering, Jonathan sighed, blood bubbling in his throat. Then he felt lifted and drawn back, like an arrow fitted to a bronze bow. Back, 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 and then release. Pain vanished. Grief fell away. He burst into freedom in a twinkling of an eye. He moved into glorious colors and sounds, past myriads of singing angels, straight and true, to the mark set in heaven. And then Jonathan stood there, astonished and overwhelmed with joy, as he was embraced by the true prince who ushered him into the presence of God. And that's the end of chapter 6.